When I look at my BitTorrent client here, I have a lot of stalled downloads, and I have even more stuck in downloading metadata. The problem is that these torrents block all of the ones in queue, which are just waiting for that turn to get downloaded. But now I found a much better solution that will take care of this and manage my torrents 100% automatically. Cleanuperr is a Docker container that keeps an eye on your torrents. It automatically removes stuck downloads and triggers a new search using your R apps like Sonar or Radar. It also does some other cool things like blocking specific files, and it can clean up your downloads once they are finished. In this video, I'll show you how to set everything up from start to finish. I will be installing it on Unraid, but it doesn't really matter. These settings are exactly the same no matter how you run it. And that is what this video is all about. Cleanuperr have a lot of settings, and at first glance it can look a bit overwhelming. So let's start with a quick overview of how everything works together. First, we have the main settings. This is why you set your time zone, the schedule, and also if you want to do a dry run, which just means that Cleanuperr will run without actually making any changes. Then we get into the QueueCleaner settings. This will check your downloads on a schedule and give them a strike if they're stuck. After the set number of strikes, the download gets deleted and a new search is then sent to Sonar or Radar or whatever you're using. The ContentBlocker will block files you don't want from downloading. And up here we have the main settings for that, but we are going to define which files to block and where under the app settings. Next, the download cleaner. This will check your active torrents after they finish downloading. Based on the rules you set here, it can remove them from the downloads folder. This is meant for hard link setup, so your actual media files won't be deleted. Finally, we get to the app settings. Put in your details to connect to the various apps you use, like Sonar, Radar, your download client, etc., etc. This will allow Cleanuperr to trigger new searches whenever a stuck download is removed. This is also where you can define the files you want to block or allow. You can install QueueCleaner via Docker, Unraid, or directly on your operating system by downloading from the GitHub page. I will be installing on Unraid, and here you just need to go to the apps page and then search for Cleanuperr and choose install. If you're using Unraid or Docker, you will need to give Cleanuperr access to the same folder where you save your downloads. I have it set up using trash guides. I will not be covering this in this video, but just know that if you're not using hard links, you cannot use the download cleaner. You can still use the QueueCleaner and ContentBlocker though. In Unraid, to add a drive, scroll all the way to the bottom of the settings page and then click add another path. The settings here should be the exact same as you have in your download client Docker settings. So as you can see, mine is set to mount user main shared data. And this is also what I have put in here. Then in my download client, I have set the full path to the download. But yeah, you have to set it up exactly like this in order for the download cleaner to work. Okay, so let's get started with the general and logging settings. These are the basic options that controls how Cleanuperr behaves behind the scene. First of all, we have the time zone. This sets the time zones for the logs and determine when scheduled jobs are running. It doesn't really affect functionality, but it will make everything easier if you set this to your own time zone. On Wikipedia, you can find a list of all time zones. So if you are in Sao Paulo, for example, you'll put in America/Sao Paulo. Next, we have the dry run. This is a pretty important setting. When it is set to true, Cleanuperr will simulate everything. It will log what it would have done, but it won't actually change anything. So this is great for testing that everything is set up correctly. And I highly recommend that you set this to true until you are confident, and then later you can switch it to false when you are ready to go live. Now for the logging settings, this is how Cleanuperr reports what it is doing. So first we have the logging level. This controls how much detail you will see in the logs. Information is a good default, but you can set this up or down if you want more or less information here. Next we have the logging file. We can enable this if we want a file to be written to desk. By default, Cleanuperr will just output to the log, which is typically fine for a Docker setup. If you enable this, you also need to give Cleanuperr a path where it can save this log file. Next, we have enhanced logging here. This adds more detailed context to your logs, like what triggered an action and why. I recommend leaving this set to true, especially if you are still learning how everything works. Okay, so next up we have the triggers. These will control when Cleanuperr will run each of its jobs. They use something called cron syntax, and if you're not really sure what this is, head over to crontab.guru, and here you can play around with cron syntax. So this, for example, mean every 5 minutes. There's also an examples page down here where you can see some common examples. One thing is that Cleanuperr here uses this question mark, which basically means that this will run no matter what year it is. I haven't tested out if it works without the question mark, so I just left it in there. If you just want to copy my settings, I have set the QueueCleaner and the ContentBlocker to run every 5 minutes and the download cleaner to run once a day at midnight. Okay, so now we're getting into one of the most useful parts of Cleanuperr, at least in my opinion, the QueueCleaner. What this does is that it watches your active torrents and then gives them a strike when something is wrong, if it's stalled, if it failed to import, or even if it's just downloading too slow. Then when a torrent gets too many strikes, it will be removed from your download client and a new search will be triggered in your R app, like Sonar or Radar or whatever. So let's get through what each of these settings mean and what you should put in there. Okay, so first of all, you want to enable the QueueCleaner, unless of course you don't want to use it. So set this as true. Then we have the ignored downloads path. This is basically just a text file with torrents that you want QueueCleaner to ignore if you want to seed them or keep downloading them for whatever reason. In this text file here, you can put in hashes, categories, and trackers. Next, we have the run sequentially, and this basically just means that QueueCleaner will run after the ContentBlocker, which we'll get to in a short while, instead of at the same time. Keep this as true unless you have a really good reason not to. Okay, so let's talk about the import fail settings. These are for downloads that fail to import into Sonar, Radar, etc., etc. The first one is the max strikes. In this case, this is set to 5. So if a download fails to import 5 times, it will be removed. You can also set this to 0 to disable this whole thing entirely. Next, we have the ignore private. Set this to true if you want to skip checking private torrents. And this is really useful if you are worried about ratio or tracker rules on private trackers. If you set this to true, then this next one here, delete private, doesn't do anything. But if this is set to false, then this matters. Okay? And what this does is that if a private torrent does get enough strikes, then this control will determine whether Cleanuperr should actually delete the torrent or not. Again, set it to false if you want to play it safe. But again, it doesn't matter if you set this to true. Then we have ignore patterns, and what this allows you to do is to skip known harmless import errors using patterns. So for example, manual import required. These will match the messages in your log, and if the error contains these phrases here, this strike will be skipped. So you can have more than one pattern. You just want to duplicate this line and then change the 0 to a 1 and put in the other message in there. Next up, we have the settings for whenever a torrent is stalled. The first one is the max strikes. So just as before, this is set to 5. So whenever a torrent is stuck and not making any progress for 5 checks in a row, it will be removed. Remember that the frequency of the checks here is what we set in the triggers, right? So I set it to every 5 minutes. So in my case here, it will be removed if stalled for 25 minutes. Next, we have the reset strikes on progress. So if you set this to true, Cleanuperr will reset the strike counter if a torrent shows any progress between steps, even if it's just 0.5%. And then just as before, we have the ignore private and delete private. It's exactly the same. You can skip. I probably want to set this to true, but you can skip any torrents from private trackers here. We also have a single setting for when a torrent is stuck in downloading metadata, and this is the max strike. So this is the only thing we can set for that, but we also do have some settings for slow torrents, and on unrate for some reason these are all the way down here at the end. But it is the similar pattern. As you can see, we have the max strike, we have reset on progress, and then we have the option to ignore and delete private torrents. However, we also have some additional options here. We have the slow minimum speed. Anything slower than this will be considered too slow and get a strike. Then we have the max time. This is how many minutes a download is allowed to take before being considered slow and getting a strike. And finally, we have the ignore above size. If a torrent is bigger than this size, Cleanuperr will ignore it for the slow check. And this is obviously useful if you're often downloading very big files. Next up, we have the ContentBlocker settings. This scans your downloads and blocks any unwanted files. It works both for situations where you just want to block specific files like NFO files or exe files, but it also works for more advanced situations where you want to protect your system from malicious files. So first of all, we can simply enable or disable the ContentBlocker feature. Next, just like with the QueueCleaner, we have this file here that lets you skip certain torrents from being blocked. You simply just want to add your torrent to this file using hash, categories, or trackers, and Cleanuperr will ignore them. I am just using the same file here as I'm using in the QueueCleaner, but you could use different files if you want to do that. And again, just as before, we have the option to ignore or to delete private torrents, but you should be very familiar with this by now. What we actually want to block is set in the block list file. You will need one or more text files that lists what it is you want to block. So this right here is my example file. It shows you how it works. But if you are more concerned about malicious files, you should use the example file from the Cleanuperr docs site, which is way more complete. But for now, this is it for the ContentBlocker settings. We will set which files to use a little later when we get into the settings for the R instances. Okay, so let's talk about the download cleaner. This is used to clean up your torrent client and the downloads folder after your torrents are done downloading and done seeding. Now, very important, this is meant to work with hard links. So only enable this if you are using hard links in your setup. If you're not sure what hard links is, you probably don't want to enable this until you fully understand it and are sure that that is the way you have set up your system. So the very first option we have is if we want to enable or disable the download cleaner. And the next one here is the ignored downloads path. This is just as we talked about a couple of times now. We have a text file where we can put in hashes, categories, or trackers to the torrent files that we want download cleaner to ignore. I am again just using the same file for all of these, but you can use different files. Then we have the option if it should also delete torrents from private trackers, and I have set that to false. And then we get into the categories. So here you will tell Cleanuperr which categories to watch and for how long it should let downloads in that category seed before removing them. The category has to be the exact same here as it is in your torrent client. And for the seed settings, the maximum ratio and the minimum seed time are connected, so both of these has to be true before a torrent gets removed. where the maximum seed time overrides everything else, and once this has been reached, it will remove the torrent no matter what. So let's take an example here. Let's say that I have a download in my TV Sonar category in my BitTorrent client. Once it has reached a ratio of 1 and it has been seeding for more than 6 hours, then the torrent will get removed. If it has been seeding for 6 hours but only have a ratio of 0.5, then it will not get removed. However, once we get to 24 hours, it will get removed no matter what the ratio is. So that's the way it works. You can have multiple categories. You just want to duplicate these lines or these variables and then change this 0 to a 1 for all of them, or a 2 or 3 depending on how many categories you have. And finally, I just want to say that remember that since we're using hard links, your actual downloads will not be deleted. They will just disappear from the torrent client and the downloads folder, but they will still be available in your media library. Then we have the unlinked settings here. And all that this does is that it changes the category from whatever it says here to whatever it says here if the files are saved to this folder. This is something you would typically use if you are cross-seeding, which is when you are using the same files in multiple different torrents. You can have multiple categories as well, but you can only have one directory and one target category. So again, just as before, if you want multiple categories, you just want to duplicate this variable, and then you want to change the 0 to a 1 or the 1 to a 2, etc., etc. Okay, so we are almost done. The last thing we have to cover are the apps section of the settings. So this is the download client, and it is all the sonar, radar, lidar, etc. apps. First, we start with the download client. You can choose from one of these three: QueueTorrent, Deluge, or Transmission. You can only choose one, and you only have to put in the settings for the one you choose. So for me, I have chosen QueueTorrent here, so I haven't put in any settings for Deluge or Transmission. These settings are the URL. If you're using a URL base, you'll put that in here. Then you put in your login details, and that is it. It's the same for Deluge and Transmission. Okay, and next we get to the R apps here. So we'll start here with Sonar. You can choose to enable or disable this app. Then you can choose your block type if you want to use a blacklist or a whitelist. If you don't want to use anything here, set it to blacklist and then delete this block path. Then it will basically black nothing. If you set it like I have done here, then it will blacklist all the file types that are inside this text file. If you set it to whitelist, then it will only download the type of files that are inside this text file. Then for Sonar specifically, we can choose to download per episode, or search rather per episode, per season, or per series, whatever you want to do here. Then you put in the URL to the instance, including the port number, and you put in your API key. You get the API key from all the R apps. You open up the app, and then you go to Settings, General, scroll down to Security, and here you can find your API key. If you want to have more instances, so maybe you have a Sonar 4K instance, just duplicate these two variables here and change the 0 to a 1, or a 2 or a 3, etc., just like we did earlier. And then you can have multiple instances. Then we come down here to radar. Again, we can enable, disable, set the blacklist file, and we have the URL and the API key, and again we can have multiple instances. So pretty much the same settings. For lidar, it is the same. We can enable, disable, blacklist, put in the URL and API key, and we can have multiple instances. For notify, we put in our API key, the channel ID, and then we have a bunch of settings here for what we want to be notified about. And it's the same thing for the AppRise. We put in the URL, API key, and then we have all these settings for what we want to be notified about. And that is it for the app settings. So we made it. We got through all the settings for Cleanuperr. I hope this was easy to follow along and that everything was clear. There was a lot to go through, but hopefully this video helped you understand how to set everything up. And before we end the video, I just quickly want to show you how my QueueCleaner looks now after I've been running this for a couple of hours. This is all that is left. It is mostly some torrents that are still seeding, and then it is downloading one thing here. But if you remembered in the beginning of the video, I showed you that I have had like 300 torrents or something. I don't actually remember right now, but there were a lot, right? A lot of stalled, downloading metadata and everything like that. But this has really helped getting everything downloaded and really cleaned up my QueueCleaner. So it's definitely worth it, even though you have a lot of settings to go through. Cleanuperr is really a powerful tool once you dial it in, and hopefully by now you should have everything you need to do just that. So finally, I just want to say that if you found this helpful and useful, feel free to drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stuff like this. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.